Hello and welcome to the section on pivot tables. We're going to take a look at everything pivot tables this week. Uh, First, we're going to kind of define pivot tables for you, kind of give you the conceptual definition of pivot tables and explain some of the uses. Then we're going to create some pivot tables and take a look at the basic interface. And finally, we're going to do some analysis of this data set. So let's get started. So pivot tables are incredibly useful, really a flexible tool. Essentially, a pivot table is taking this raw data, right, in our data set, and it is taking these fields that we have, in other words, the column header, if you will, like date, date a week, accounting, type, amount, and so forth, and it is giving you a different type of view, right, that pivots from view to view very quickly so that you can take a look at these fields and you can do all kinds of different things. You can sum, you can count, you can get minimums, maximums. You can do a tremendous amount within pivot tables. What is some of the uses of pivot tables is you can manipulate the data really quickly. For example, we're taking some fields now. We're looking at account and the sum of the cash flow and some branches and so forth, but you can take this and look at it in so many different ways. For example, you can take type. Excuse me. You can take type of accounts and you can throw them under each of the branches and you can get a really quick look at it. And then you can pull it out just as quickly. You can manipulate it very quickly and you can move these around. You can do all kinds of interesting things just by dragging and dropping. So you're not writing a lot of formulas to get sums and averages and so forth. You're actually manipulating it from this interface, which is what is basically called an object in Excel. It's a pivot table object. You can also use pivot tables to quickly drill down into data using filters. So we can take, again, we can take our type and place it in this filters area. And we can take a look at, for example, current contributions and just click OK, and you'll see where these figures change, right? So you can drill down, you can get more and more granular with your data. The third thing we can do is we can create all kinds of charts, tables and charts from pivot tables. Now we're going to get into charts in the next chapter, and so we'll walk through that in detail. But essentially, we can take this table that I've created very quickly, and we can make a really quick chart out of it. Oh, there it is. There we go. We can make really quick charts out of those as well. So don't worry about it if you didn't follow through this first part, because we're going to walk through how to create each and every one of these. Just remember, the pivot tables are very powerful. You can manipulate data, you can drill down into data, you can look at the data in different ways. You can find potential relationships between the fields or variables, if you will, and you can create tables and create visuals through pivot tables. So it's a very powerful tool. So let's go ahead and take a look at how at the basic interface and the creation of a pivot table. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at how we create a pivot table, and let's take a look at the basic interface. Along the way, I'm going to be giving you some tips. The pivot tables can get the interface can get a little confusing, so I'm going to try and give you some trouble spots to take a look at. And let's get started. So here we have our raw data set, right? Tabular data, data organized in rows and columns and so forth. Even though we have a small little title up here, we're really concerned with this area where the main data resides. And we're going to create a pivot so that we can start doing a little analysis on this area. So to create a pivot table, you go to the Insert tab, and we're going to look at the Tables group, and specifically at the pivot table area. Now, you can also create pivot tables from actual tables that are have filters on them and so forth. We're going to create it from this raw data. I'm going to click on the pivot table command, and of course Excel is going to give us our little marching ants. It's going to assume that this is a data that we want to roll into a pivot table, and this is exactly what we want in that pivot table. We don't want this People's Choice Bank August account history in in the pivot table. So if you scroll through very quickly, you can see that there are no blanks in here, which is really important because you don't want to choose the wrong data. Now, you have a couple of choices. You can put the pivot table into an existing worksheet, so you can literally put it on this worksheet. Most of the time it's much easier to put it on a new worksheet, and we have that chosen right now. And we are going to click OK. Now, when we click OK, Excel is going to add a sheet. If you'll take a look down here, we have a sheet. It's called Sheet 6 at the moment. Normally, if it was your first pivot table, it would say Sheet 1. We can always rename that, of course. I'm going to rename it. We'll name it August Pivot. All right, and you get this interface. So you see the pivot table object area is right here, and then on the right hand side you see pivot table fields. Now be careful, if you click outside of the pivot table field, I'm just going to click outside of the object, you'll see that the pivot table fields actually disappear, and this can get really disconcerting at times. So if you click inside, you'll see that the tables are appear again. You also get these contextual tabs, the Analyze tab and the Design tab. More on that later, but let's say that you lose your fields for some reason. I'm going to close this, and you're like, wow, I can't find them. Well, if you go up to the Analyze tab and you look over in the Show group and you click on the field list, you get that list of fields right back. So the most of the time you're going to see this appear on the right hand side. This is kind of default area. I like to move mine. I like to move my field. So if you just hover your cursor over until you get this little this cross with the arrows on them, I'm going to left click on this. I'm going to move this field out here so I have a little more real estate. A little easier to kind of show you the interface. So if you look at the basic elements of a pivot table, you'll see four main areas, right? You see columns and rows, filters and values. So when I'm creating a pivot table, I think, okay, rows and columns are text for the most part, right? If you look at your fields up here, you have date, day of the week, accounting, and so forth. If you click over on your data, your raw set, the pivot hasn't gone anywhere. We see this corresponds to the headers up top in your main data set. So we know that some of the categories we might look at are something like account and type, right? The numerical data resides in the value area. So this is the in values you want something to come up so that you have something to count, right? Money, maybe it's counting transactions or whatever it happens to be. So in this case, let's go ahead and take a look at the branch. Now, a couple of ways to get these fields into these areas. You can just simply put a check mark, right? And we'll see in the rows area we get branch. We have 3 branches in this case, and they appear up here in A4, 5, and 6, right? So far, nothing we're really counting on. The second way you can do this is simply to left click on the field and drag it down to the row, right? And we want something to count on. We want something to, give us some sort of data to count in the sum and the average and so forth. So I'm going to take cash flow and drag it into the values area. There we go. Now, right off the bat, it tells you something about the sum of cash flow. This is a total of cash flow in each of the 3 branches plus a grand total. So this saves you from writing any kind of complicated formulas, right? And I'm going to highlight this data because I really want it to look like money, right? So a really quick way to do that is to highlight and go up here to your numbers group that will where you can specify what kind of data you want, right? Whether there's a date or currency and so forth. In this case, I'm going to do currency. And there we go. We can see that the total cash flow at Anderson Hills at the moment is the highest, right? Blue with Delhi, Delhi coming in second and Blue Ash third. So it tells us a little bit of something, right? Of course, we can add some more detail to this. For example, we can take a look and say, well, what kind of accounts do we have? We can pull this down into a column, right? And now we've broken down those totals that we can take a look at, differentiate between certificates of deposit, checking, IRAs, savings, and so forth. So the best way to learn this is to play around with it, right? I mean, we can just as easily pull this account down under branch, right? And you'll get subcategories where you have the branch with the categories of accounts under each of those. And then you can do all kinds of neat things, like you can collapse this anytime, right? By clicking on these little minus arrows, right? And it just sort of depends what is the most convenient and most visually pleasing to present. You know, perhaps you're presenting to a boss or a group, something like that. And so you may want to present it different ways. So we can do all kinds of neat little things here. We can switch these around. We can drag and drop them in different places. We can add groups to them. So we can put type down here. You can manipulate the data very quickly, and this can kind of give you a feel for the data, if you will. I'm going to move this back out. Now the other field is this filter field, a really powerful field where you can drill down into the data. I'm going to take this type that we were just looking at, I'm going to drag it into this filters area. So you haven't seen anything change here yet. But if I wanted to present this data in a different way, I can click on this little drop down arrow and we can get different kinds of filters. And let's say I just want to look at new accounts, for example. I'll click on this and click OK, and what we have is the summed data, the totals for all new accounts that are IRAs, certificates of deposits, etc., within any of these branches. And of course we can go and we can select multiple areas too. We can look at renewals, withdrawals at the same time, and you can quickly summarize and drill down into data, aggregate data. You can do all kinds of neat things. I'm going to do all in this case. Actually, I'm going to take this filter off for the moment because you can do more than just sum. You can get perhaps something that might be more useful for us in this case is to do averages. So I'm actually going to select this data and I'm going to right click. Now we can also go up and change this in the analyze area, but I find this like a really easy and kind of intuitive method. If you right click, you'll see this menu display, and it'll give you lots of options. For example, instead of summing, we can average, right? We can also count the number of accounts. We can get the max for each one of these areas and minimum. We can even do more than that if you click on more options. We can also show the values in lots of different ways for percentage differences, running totals. So a little bit more advanced, but as you play around with it, you might want to experiment with some of those. For the moment, let's just look at average. And instead of totals, we get average, which might tell us something about the data we're not seeing in sums, right? Because these are different size branches. So we can also take a look at the number of accounts in each of these areas. So we can do account. Now, of course, at the moment, we've got the account looks like money. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to go to Home tab. And I'm going to change currency to a numerical value. And I'm going to take away a couple of the decimals. So we can see that we have, for example, at Anderson Hills certificate deposits, we have 100. right? Blue Ash, we have 60. Delhi, 56 and so forth, and grand total. So you can, pivot tables are so powerful because you can change this data so quickly. And you can look at it in so many different ways. Let's go back to sum, and I'm going to change this back to money and give us a little real estate here. And there you have it. That's a basic pivot table. I tell you, the way to learn pivot tables is to experiment. It is to play around with these fields. It's to make the mistake of clicking outside many times and your field's disappearing. Sometimes when you're in the middle of analyzing a set of data, this can be disconcerting, but just look around and you can get those fields back up. So that is basic creation and the interface of pivot tables. Let's go ahead and take a look at just some standard analysis of data in the next section. Okay, so let's do some very simple analysis on this data set. So we're going to stay with the same data set we've been using. And I've already ran my pivot over in this area. So we're going to take a look at a couple of different things. Let's just try and answer a couple of these questions in here. Do some descriptive analytics, right? Describing the data to give us some sort of insight into a business decision. So let's get a sum of transaction amounts by branch location. Let's go over here and take a look. And we're going to take a branch, put it in a row, right? And we're going to take amount to have something that counts. And I am going to make that into currency or an accounting format so that it looks like it is intuitive. So here we have Anderson Hills clearly is the highest amount of sales, followed by these other two branches very closely. Another thing we may be interested in is we can say, well, what is the percentage, right? What's the percentage of each of those branch locations? So here's something really interesting. You can actually use two instances of value, right? You can, well, really in any of these quadrants. I'm going to pull amount in and put it right below sum of amount and watch what happens here. We get a second sum of amount column here. Now that doesn't help us, it's the same data, but if I highlight this, I'm going to right click and I'm going to summarize this as, actually I'm going to show values as a percentage of the grand total of each of these fields. So let's take a look. We can see that Anderson Hills not only has this amount of sales, but also constitutes 47.2% of that amount. So this is another way of presenting the data, another way of describing the data, and it may affect the actual type of decision that a manager might make, and it could concern any number of things. You know, personnel staffing levels, marketing efforts, sales, all kinds of issues. Hiring, any number of results could come out of this really simple analysis. And of course, this is a descriptive, prescriptive, and is a little more complicated, but a little beyond the scope of the course at this point. But here's another thing you can, if you want to keep this and keep running on this particular set of data, I'm actually going to highlight the branches with the grand total, and I'm going to copy this. I'm going to move down a bit, and I'm going to do a paste special. Remember that? A paste special. I'm going to paste values and the number formatting. So I can make a really quick table out of this now. I can do total sales, and I can do percentage of sales. And then we can take this table and we can, we can format it however we like, and to take and perhaps copy and paste this into a presentation, something like that. Now we can go back up to our pivot table if we like, and we can do a different, run a different set of data. For example, if we want to take a look at the, let's see, some of transaction amounts by customer. So we know we have new and current customers we're differentiating between, but let's go ahead and take out our branch and add our customer, right? So within all three branches, we have the current amount, right? The total sales, which of course are going to be the same as down here. But then we have the current amount of current customers versus new customers across all three branches. Again, different type of question and different type of presentation of data. We could further break that down by branch, right? So we could look at percentages within each of those, and then we could take that data if we wish, and we can paste this into a table again. We can keep our percentages and our totals and so forth, and we can put our appropriate labels on it. So you can see how flexible these are. These pivot tables are. It's and a really effective tool to make decisions. So so let's do one more thing as we go through. I'll leave it to you. You can experiment with this and look at sum of transaction amounts, sum of transaction amounts by branch and account type, and so forth. Really, you can pivot around the table in endless ways to help kind of triangulate decisions. Another thing you can do is you can add to this raw data to put into your pivot table. Now, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to pull everything out of here for the moment because I'd like you to be able to view the fields as we embark on this next tip. Okay, so we see all the tips here and the fields here, and they correspond with these. Hey, let's do something. Let's classify these amounts. Let's classify our customers by kind of well, for argument's sake, low value, medium value, high value type of deposit currently in the branch. I'm going to insert a field in here. I'm going to call it level, for lack of a better word. And we are going to give each account one designator of low, medium, and high. So how do we do that? Well, I've got my small little array over here that I've made. I can make that on another sheet, of course. And we're going to do that VLOOKUP table. Remember that? VLOOKUP, and of course lookup value. We look in the column. We're going to look at this amount. Then we're going to put a comma, and we're going to look at the table array, and that's this little table array over here. And then we're going to look in the second column of that table array. And then finally, we're going to do an approximate match. So if you looked at the video on lookup tables, we've done this one time, right? But by experience, I know I'm going to have to make this into a absolute reference. So I'm going to put my cursor in the L16, hit F4, and then in M18 and L4 again. We're going to make that absolute references, and we're going to enter. Now I'm going to go over and I'm going to double click to apply this down the entire column, and there we go. We have now classified customers into low, medium, or high value customers, essentially. So how does that help us? Well, let's see. Let's go to our August pivot. If you'll notice, that level field is not in this list of fields, okay? But that's easily remedied. We're going to go to data and we're going to refresh all, and keep your eye on the pivot table field. You'll see now that we have level, right? So if we were to look at branches, and we're going to take a look at level, right? And let's take a look at our amount, okay? And of course, we don't really want the, well, we could look at the monetary value as well of each of those. And you can see there is a significant variation, right? Our high value customers are obviously outstripping our low and medium almost combined. So, but let's take a look at the the number, we're going to right click and we're going to summarize by a count. And I'm going to change that to a numerical value and get rid of a couple of these guys, and there you go. You can get some idea about the number of high value, low value, medium value customers. Oops, forgot to change this one. Okay. So what does that tell you? Well, it could lead to any number of conclusions. It could lead to focus on different markets, marketing efforts to specific groups and so forth. Maybe you're trying to increase the value of quote unquote low value customers. So maybe you're trying to get that up. Maybe you're trying to concentrate on high value customers and so forth. So as you can see, there are so many different ways to manipulate this data. To kind of combine what you've learned with lookup tables and formulas and functions and so forth, and push those into pivot tables where you can quickly aggregate and summarize data to make sound business decisions.